in Jerusalem. Biblical belief comes first, and it is exclusive of all other beliefs. The Lord thy God is a jealous God. Thou shalt not have strange gods before me. The idol of reason is a strange God. So for that reason, the moral man will pursue morality with a passion. Again, this harks back to the romanticism that we find there. Not on the basis of some cogitation, but because he has made the criterionless choice. He has chosen the or rather than the either. Why did he do it? There's nothing to say. This is what he's chosen. This is the best that human life has to offer. The simple, primary commitment to righteousness, independent of pleasure, independent of rationality, independent of any possible alternative. There is a fierceness, a fanaticism to this, which, again, is kind of appalling if you stop and think about what kind of a guy we're talking about. And I'll try and get across to you the degree of fanaticism that attaches to this. Because in some respects, he formulates a very interesting system, and in fact, there seems to be a certain method to this madness. There is a certain degree of logic and reason to it. It's just that the point here, as in the case of so many romantic writers and romantic artists, is that they want to go beyond reason to some transcendent realm that you get access to or that you connect to on the basis of some primary intuition rather than any activity of rational analysis. One of the great romantic thinkers in that respect. Now, in order to get across to you the difference between the either and the or, and in order to get across to you the difference between, say, the Enlightenment and Romanticism, in order to get across to you the difference between Kant and Kierkegaard, I think we should choose to examine the theology of these two gentlemen, Kant and Kierkegaard, because they are perfect paradigms of the kind of thinking that they represent. And, fortunately for us, Kant and Kierkegaard were considerate enough to both make comments about the same biblical story, at least one of them, maybe more than one, but there's at least one biblical story that both of them talk about. And it connects the problems of faith and reason in a way that highlights both the advantages and disadvantages of either position. This is the story of Abraham. You may have heard of this. It's at the beginning of the Bible, right early on in the book, so if you haven't finished it, well, you perhaps have seen this particular story. Here's the deal. Abraham is a shepherd, and God makes a covenant with him, chooses Abraham, and says, Abraham, all right, you and your descendants are going to be a chosen people. I have a special connection with you. And to do you a big favor, since you're 100 and your wife Sarah's 90, I'm going to send you a child. Now, I don't know how Sarah felt about that at 90 years of age. She may not have thought of it as much of a great gift, but Abraham is very pleased with the gift. And then later on in the story, God appears to Abraham, and God says, Abraham, in his own inscrutable way, God says, I want you to sacrifice your son. No explanation, no explication, no justification, just God told him to do this. Now the question is, what are we supposed to think about things like that? Shall we take it in an allegorical way? Shall we take it literally? What are we supposed to think about a God who gives you things like a family, and then who, for no obvious reason, who in a rather capricious way decides to tell you, now kill him. He's your only son. Destroy him as a way of showing how much you like me. It's a horrifying choice. Now Kant has a very interesting read on that, and it's in a footnote, maybe the greatest footnote in the history of philosophy. It's in a book called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, which is a typically Kantian idea, right? I mean, I could almost just tell you the title of it, and you could probably pick out that Kant is the kind of guy who would write a book like that. And what he says in this footnote, this very important footnote, rather pregnant, is that if it were the case that God should appear to us by some miracle, literally speaking, we couldn't just fall down on our knees and do what God told us. We'd have to stop and ask ourselves, is this really God? I mean, that's the kind of thing a rationalist does. When God appears to me, he asks, who are you? Right? The kind of free, enlightened rationality characteristic of the Enlightenment. Well, I want to know who I'm talking to first. Now, one assumes, God has never talked to me, so I'm not sure about this. My sense is, and this is Kierkegaard's sense, that when you see him, you know what you're looking at, right? I mean, there's got to be something special about his properties in a visible sense that would let you know that you're dealing with something unusual. But that's not enough for Kant, because he wants rational certainty. So Kant says, In order to find out if this big thing of light or the burning bush or whatever it is that's talking to you is really God, you've got to find out if he really has the properties of God. And what properties does God have? Well, he's perfectly rational and he's perfectly free. You can't imagine him being unfree. You can't imagine him being irrational. It's like saying God is a lisp. Right? So he's perfectly free, perfectly rational, perfectly knowledgeable, perfectly good, perfectly virtuous. That means he always follows the categorical imperative. Why? Because there's only one rule for moral behavior. It's true for individual human beings, it's true for nations, but it's also true for God and the angels. This goes all the way up the hierarchy, right to the boss. And you know he's God because he's perfectly free and perfectly rational, which means that he's perfectly autonomous, he's never heteronymous, he's never moved by anger or jealousy or anything like that. He's the perfect Kantian. In other words, you'll know you're talking to God when everything he tells you to do is consistent with the categorical imperative. If some big bright ball of light should ever start talking to you and tells you to do anything that's inconsistent with the categorical imperative, you know you're talking to the devil or one of the devil's pals, because God never violates the categorical imperative. God can't do that. It's not that he can't do that. It's the wrong way to think about it, but that blasphemous utterance comes close to being the rationalistic conception of God. God, by virtue of his very nature, by his freedom, by his knowledge, by his goodness, always obeys the categorical imperative. Elsewise, you'd be saying that he was vicious and unfree. So now, let's stop and think about this ball of light that's telling me to sacrifice my son. Can I universalize the maxim? Could I wish that everybody should sacrifice their son whenever a ball of light talks to them? No. So that means that this is inconsistent with the CI. And if it's inconsistent with the categorical imperative, it's not God, because God always obeys the categorical imperative. So whenever burning bushes or balls of light, whatever it is that starts talking to you, make sure that you test it with the categorical imperative. That's the ultimate rule of morals. And that never can let you down. There is an element of Promethean Greek rationality in the Kantian view, which is rather impious. Who are you to question God? Who are you to tell God what the rules are? He's God. There is an element here of rationality, of a limitation of faith, which is not consistent with the simple arbitrary subjection to the will of God, which is characteristic of the most vehement, perhaps the most fanatical of religious believers. Tertullian, I believe because it is absurd. Kant would wince to hear that. What kind of a belief is that? Any God worth believing in is going to be rational. I mean, that's part of what makes him virtuous. Think about the Kantian conception of morality, and then you think about the Kantian conception of God, and you're going to find out that Kant's God is a Prussian. Kant's God likes moral rules just for the sake of having them. He likes rules and he obeys them perfectly, which is what a Prussian God would do. In other words, Kant's God looks remarkably like Kant with all his vices taken away. In other words, he's the super Kant. He always obeys the CI. Now, let's look at the other alternative from the perspective of Kierkegaard, the romantic approach. All right? And this is in a section of a book called Fear and Trembling, which is the kind of charming title that Kierkegaard often gives to his books. There's another one called The Concept of Dread. I think you'll like that. That's a real page-turner. All right? Anxiety, despair, that kind of thing. You can see how Sartre's going to get the cue for nausea out of this. I mean, think of something really horrible and write a book about it, or tell us that that's the human condition. Well, that's essentially what Kierkegaard does. He says in Fear and Trembling is a long passage about Abraham, and what a great guy Abraham is. Why? He doesn't sit there and ask God questions. God tells him to do something, he goes do it. That's it. That's what religious faith means. No compromises, no nonsense, none of this Greek rational stuff, none of this presumptuous categorical imperative business. God told me to do something, I'm going to go do it. That's what's great about Abraham. Now, Kierkegaard says, not only is that great, but he goes on for about 40 pages telling us what a tremendous thing this is to do. And then he points out that this is unethical. I mean, literally speaking, that killing your son is the kind of thing that most sane people think is an evil, and actually Kierkegaard himself does. And here's where he makes what might be thought of as an addendum to his theory. It appears that it's not just a two-part separation between the aesthetic and the moral life. It appears that once you get into the moral life, once you make that transition from the either to the or, what you get is the possibility for further ultimate and complete transcendence, complete submission to the will of God. And that comes in when we move from the moral life to the religious life, to the life of simple but profound faith, which brooks no obstacles and will not even slow down for considerations of rational calculation. So in other words, what Kierkegaard says is that Abraham was one of the great men of faith, one of the great religious figures in the world, precisely because what he is doing makes no sense. If it made sense, it wouldn't be nearly so good. Can you see, first of all, the romantic elements here, the rejection of rationality, the rejection of reasonable order, the rejection of the Greek humanism that's built right into the Enlightenment project? What he is saying is, on this rock I will build my religious faith. I am going to be the faithful man of God. The comparison between Kierkegaard and Job is not facetious. He is a modern Job. The Enlightenment thinkers like Kant have some of the are in some respects like Job's wife and Job's friends who tell him, you ought to blaspheme if God isn't doing what you expect him to do, what you want him to do. Kierkegaard, like Job, says, no. There's only one God, and he's what he is, and I am what I am. I'm, relatively speaking, an insect, a worm. I'm not going to tell God how to run the universe. So if God appears to me one day, I wouldn't hold your breath on that, but if he does ever appear to me one day, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do exactly what he tells me. I'm not going to ask him, is this consistent with the categorical imperative? I'm not going to interrogate him. I'm not going to ask him, are you sure you're running the world?